So is the new iPhone 14 Pro good enough to replace one of these, a professional grade stills camera? This camera and the Canon EOS R6, along with the lenses used in this video, come to roughly a $5,000 price tag.
Today we're in London and we're going to be answering that question, comparing the ease of the iPhone 14 Pro and the power of the Canon EOS R6.
Let's kick things off here. We've got two shots, camera A here and then camera B. Obviously one of these is with that 48 megapixel wide sensor.
We're mainly going to be focusing on the brand new 48 megapixel sensor on the back of the iPhone 14 Pro, but of course we'll compare the telephoto too. I'm actually not going to be focusing on the rear facing camera because I actually don't own a lens that goes wide enough for the Canon EOS R6. That's already a big win for the iPhone if you are looking at buying that. It's not that easy to get a super wide angle like that, but of course we'll be covering that in the full review, so stay tuned for that.
So going back to that first shot, we obviously have the camera A, that was the iPhone, and then camera B was the Canon EOS R6. Not an absolute ton of differences here. I was really impressed with how the iPhone actually did, and this was not a portrait mode shot, and you can see just by comparing them side by side how much natural depth of field you actually get in the shots on the iPhone 14 Pro. Another main rear facing camera comparison, so we got camera A here, switching over to camera B. I wonder if you can tell which is which with this one. Maybe right if you said camera A was the EOS R6 on this one and camera B being the iPhone. One more here on the standard 12 megapixel shots downsampled from that 48 megapixel sensor before we move on to the telephoto and then of course onto Pro RAW mode. Side by side for this one, you would be right if you said that camera A was the iPhone and camera B was the R6. So I never actually owned the iPhone 13 Pro, which means I've never had a telephoto lens on an iPhone, and I'm absolutely loving it. So now let's throw up some telephoto shots. I'm going to do things slightly differently here. We'll call this the quickfire round. Here is a bunch of shots. Camera A and camera B being exactly the same, both shot with that 77mm 3x optical zoom, and obviously as close to that as possible on the Canon EOS R6. I'd be super interested to know kind of how you're getting on with this, like whether you find it easy or whether you find this hard as we continue to go through some of these images. This one here, for instance, particularly seems fairly obvious. It is interesting to see the characteristics of each camera. This one, you know, not so much. Like this is much closer. I don't think you'll be surprised when I say camera A here was of course the Canon EOS R6 and camera B being the iPhone. Like I said, some of those camera characteristics are just super interesting. Like the iPhone always wants to pretty much keep as much as possible exposed in these shots. I can see the difference in the highlights here and also this shot here. Like this is a clear difference. The Canon is kind of happy overexposing that sky, or at least you would want to overexpose the sky in order to capture the main subjects of the photograph. Whereas the iPhone does it all for you instantly, but obviously exposes that whole photo, which in my opinion is not as much of a natural look, but for most people is probably what they're after. Where things get really interesting though is with Apple Pro RAW, and particularly the 48 megapixel full size Pro RAW shots. If I showed you this image particularly, I'm going to show you a few, but this image right here, which camera do you think that this was shot with? Because in my opinion, this is a fairly exceptional level of photograph in terms of the actual shot itself. Like nothing is over sharp, nothing sort of necessarily shouts that it was shot on a smartphone. So those first two images that you've seen were shot at 48 megapixel. This image here, slightly more zoomed in, is obviously on that 3x, which is the 12 megapixel at Pro RAW mode. But it's awesome to see that there's no real degradation of quality. Obviously, you're going to get the best images out of that 48 megapixel sensor, but it's great that you can obviously also use that 12 megapixel shot. I'm actually going to include a download down below in the description if you're curious to actually see how these kind of look in full resolution, not subject to YouTube compression. For comparison's sake, I have, of course, the Canon R6 versions of each of these photographs. Let's have a look at those side by side quickly. You can see just how impressive these images actually are. The Canon on the left and the iPhone on the right. Like all of these images are genuinely so impressive, so impressive from this 48 megapixel sensor. I actually have to leave a gap in this one in the middle of the frame, as you can see, because like I thought these were too difficult to differentiate, like that you actually can't tell where the seam was if these were kind of immediately next to each other. Just for a side note, unless you're shooting anything like particularly special, I don't think you really should ever shoot with that full size 48 megapixel mode, even though the photos do come out looking absolutely beautiful, as we've just established. The overall files come to about 80 megabytes each, which is obviously just ridiculous in terms of file size and will fill up your iPhone very, very fast. At wide focal ranges, it's actually very, very difficult to spot like big differences between the iPhone 14 Pro and a more professional camera. Obviously, we can sort of like really pixel peep and zoom in here, and you will potentially see differences, but on the surface, the iPhone really does actually punch above its weight in this category. When things start to get a little bit shaky, to be honest, and obviously the one main advantage of a more professional camera is that you have interchangeable lenses. So you've got these big piece of glass right on the front of the camera, able to magnify all that light. And it does just mean you get far, far better images at more zoomed in focal range, more depth of field, more compression. Everything just looks a lot nicer at these more zoomed in focal ranges. This is a really good comparison here of that. I don't think you'll be at all surprised to realize that this one is shot on the iPhone 14 Pro, and this one here, a far superior image, is shot on the Canon EOS R6. Apple obviously does have portrait mode to make up for this a bit though. Again, not going to spend too long on portrait mode, you guys know how I feel about this, but you know, like, it's one of these things that does do a decent job should you need it. Personally, I just prefer the real thing by far, but overall it is decent and does do a decent job, but sometimes still though, the iPhone 14 Pro definitely has a tough time sort of picking out subjects, picking out hair, that type of thing. Every time I make one of these videos, I get reminded in the comments about the fact that obviously the significant power behind a more professional setup is the ability to fine-tune that image within the edit. Professional photo files are normally always quite flat, quite muted in color, but because you have that power and control to be able to fine-tune them afterwards to how exactly you like. What's amazing is that smartphones nowadays do a lot of this computational power for you, and the iPhone 14 Pro is no exception. Like, look, all of the heavy lifting is actually done by the phone itself, and for 99% of people, that is like a massive, massive advantage. Overall though, I do think a good way of thinking about this is that you can definitely make one of the Canon shots look like an iPhone shot, but you can't really make the iPhone shot look like the Canon shot. Here's a couple of videos side by side. I'm not going to talk kind of crazy in detail about this, but I did think it would be interesting in case anyone's interested. Here's a comparison, for instance, on the main rear-facing camera, that 48 megapixel sensor. Let's see kind of how it just overall performs. This one here is actually the telephoto as well, so you've got a comparison with that, and then also obviously compared to the Canon R6. Another enormous advantage that the iPhone 14 Pro has, and it's kind of something which people don't talk about a lot, is it has like very, very impressive macro capabilities built in on this phone. To do the same thing on a professional camera, you actually need to go and buy a dedicated macro lens. There are lenses that like kind of exist just for this purpose, and you've got one like literally just on your phone, like pretty crazy. Another quick fire round, we'll do some comparisons in terms of night mode photography. Obviously night mode, a massive focus for the iPhone 14, the increased sensor sizes across the camera range, and also with Apple's improved AI processing in low light situations, there's a lot of benefit going on in terms of low light, and it definitely seems like the iPhone 14 performs, I would say, the best out of any iPhone that I've previously tested in low light, which is obviously a very good thing. It's clear to see sometimes that the extra sensor size within you know, an actual professional camera just comes in clutch in these low light situations. The amount of light that's able to be captured is just physically far more on the Canon. That does show in certain shots. The only thing I would say is that, again, we're seeing just an insanely impressive performance when it comes to things like very, very dark situations. By combining the iPhone's impressive stabilization features with its computational photography powers, you are able to just get some shots that would actually be very tricky on a normal camera, or would require actually like setting your camera up on a tripod and taking a long exposure. So there's a lot of power now in your pocket in terms of the cameras, and definitely it's clear to see that low light is being helped by Apple's new software features. Still, the biggest overall difference for me with the iPhone 14 Pro and pretty much any smartphone I use, you know, Apple is not unique in this category, but the iPhone 14 Pro is no different. It does over sharpen its images absolutely massively. Consistently, every time I shoot without that RAW mode and reduce the sharpening on an image, I can always see the difference just because the iPhone shot is always sharper than the standard Canon shot straight out of the camera. So again, showing you that shot taken in 48 megapixel Pro RAW, once edited in Lightroom, it actually looks incredible, and I'm blown away that an iPhone captured that. But obviously it is a real faff to go through that process every single time. You don't want to always be doing that. It's important to remember that this over sharpening issue is not just unique to Apple though. You can watch this video here and see how the S22 fared when I compared it to my Pro camera.